everyone, it's Maddie.
And V, and today we're going to be going over some likely critique you may get on your first draft of your first novel.
The earlier you're able to spot these things for yourself, then you're saving yourself trouble when it comes to sending to beta readers, so you've already caught the things that they're most likely to mention.
We have 6 things to talk about, so let's get to it.
Number 1 is not starting your story in the right place.
This one is so easy to do, and more often than not in our stories, it ends up that we're starting too late. We're not giving the reader enough time to properly settle into the characters' lives.
This is an easy trap to fall into because the beginning is often the hardest part. It's something that we know people are going to see and judge us on, so we want to start at the most exciting moment, and we think that maybe showing a bit too much of the characters' ordinary lives won't invest people in their story.
This couldn't be further from the truth, as you need to know the characters before the inciting incident happens so that they can be invested in their character journey. Nothing shows progression like the very beginning.
An example of a book that starts at exactly the right point is The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. In the first chapter, she tells you about Katniss and her relationship with the woods, how close she is to Gale, and what her family is like, aka her sister is the most important thing to her in the world.
Imagine if the Hunger Games had started right at the reaping. Effie had walked onto the stage and she called Prim's name, and then Katniss decided to volunteer. None of these actions would mean anything to you, though they may be exciting on paper, because you don't know the characters and their lives behind them. It doesn't take too much to endear a reader to your character, so don't feel like you need to have 50 pages before your inciting incident. It can still happen at the end of the first or second chapter, but you just really need to settle into their voice and who they are as a person before you go anywhere else.
That's not to say that you can't start a book in the middle of an action sequence.
You just have to think of the opening as a snowball effect. No matter what is happening at the beginning, the snowball is still small and it's going to roll to get big. So even if you're in the middle of an action, that doesn't mean that your ball is immediately like 2 feet wide.
Our second likely criticism is there's too much description.
New writers are often told that the 5 senses are something they need to stay loyal to, and that's a great exercise to warm up into writing. But when you're in the flow of a scene, you don't want to be bogged down by making a huge list, so you need to pick the details that are actually going to give meaning to the scene that you're writing.
Additionally, when describing your character, those descriptions only matter the first time they're introduced. Otherwise, it seems repetitive and that you're not trusting the reader to remember something. That's not to say that you can't keep adding new things about your character. Yes, you can start by telling them about what their eye colour is and how they dress, but as they appear again, you can start talking about their habits and their movements, especially for secondary characters. If your main character is getting to know them, what are they picking up on about that character that makes it specific? That could be whether they bite their nails when they're stressed, if they walk with their fists clenched, if they find themselves looking down a lot in groups of people. Just little details like that will make your character feel way more realistic than if you just choose to mention the exact shade of their hair. Description has been a really interesting thing for us in our project, since we're both responsible for one perspective, and when we're writing away from each other, it's difficult to tell what's already been established about a character.
A lot of our editing, especially when the characters are in the same location, is stripping back our description so there aren't any repetitions, but the same thing can be said if you're solo writing and you're returning to the same location multiple times throughout the book. Like, the reader will have gained a picture of that through the previous times. Like, if you're adding something, just make sure it's always new. The next thing that you should be looking out for is not enough conflict, and unfortunately this doesn't have an easy solve.
The easiest thing that we can suggest is go back to your characters and go back to your outline and make sure that actions are lining up with motivations. Everything needs to be building towards something, and that doesn't mean that every scene can be full of tension. Like, you're allowed cute fluffy scenes where your characters just get to know each other, but they're definitely at some point in the book your character will have to make a decision that isn't easy.
Unfortunately, conflict isn't something you can just add in because it naturally has consequences. So if you change one thing or add some kind of complication, then it's going to have wider effects on your whole novel. So you really have to think of conflict as a big picture change, and so long as the conflict you're adding still lines up with the characters and it makes sense for them and the scenes and the tone that you want to create, then you should be on the right track.
And if you're not sure of where conflict is most necessary in your story, go back to your outline and chart it in a peaks and troughs manner so that you can immediately recognise when things are going a little too well for your characters. Number 4 follows on from lack of conflict, and that's not having a strong antagonistic force.
Antagonistic force can be both internal and external, and maybe you're doing too much of one or not enough of the other, or you've only decided to do one. Internal is probably a lot harder to pull off because the nuances are there, and sometimes you can find that you have underplayed them and it hasn't come across quite to the reader how serious their inner conflict is.
I think the best way to tackle this one is to try and add more obstacles into your story so that it's more difficult difficult for your character to feel like their true self.
And if it comes to a villainous character, you just have to remember that they are a main character as well. They need to have as much attention to detail as your protagonist.
That's actually one of the things that we did when we were plotting out our fantasy. We thought very hard about our villain before we even started talking about our protagonists. We needed to create a threat big enough that would draw all of our characters together.
The fifth one is probably the easiest to solve, and this is being too repetitive. This could be with description, like we've already said. Maybe you didn't realise that you always fall back on writing the same kind of things. It could also be on a sentence structure level. Maybe you've got too many short sentences altogether.
This is something that you won't be able to see until you take a step away from your book, and then suddenly all of the times that you've used then and just in just a single page will leap out at you.
And our final one is having too many characters that don't serve enough purpose, or they could be serving the same one.
This is the last on our list because it's the last thing that we dealt with, and it was difficult. Like, we built up this character and had him in our novel from the very beginning, and I'd never even questioned his place in it. But then when we took a step back and actually charted our character relationships, it felt like he was filling the same role as our other main character should have been. It didn't mean that we cut him from the book completely. I don't think it would have been possible to do that, seeing as he had been living with me for like 2 years, but we definitely scaled back his involvement and tried to give him a new motivation so that he felt more unique as part of the story.
Your secondary characters need to feel 3D. They should be just as fleshed out as your main characters. You can have an idea about what their backstory would be, like what would their novel be if they were the protagonist. It's not that you have to tell those stories within this main one, but having a vague idea will help you work out their intentions, because everyone needs to have a motivation in a scene, even if they are not speaking.
So the solves for that one are either combining 2 characters into one, removing that character completely, or readdressing their purpose in the story and giving them a new lease of life.
So that's everything we have to talk about today.
We hope you found this helpful, and let us know in the comments which one of these you've struggled with the most, because for us it's definitely the no conflict one. I want my characters to be happy. Is that such a crime?
Thank you everyone so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.